What is the purpose of a restaurant? Provide food so you don't have to cook? Yes. Why does a restaurant exist? To make us happy? To make money? Variety of different thoughts. To give you an experience, or to create or curate an experience for you to be a part of. Yeah? The two things I came up with, which might be trying to simplify all those things down, are one, make food, and to serve that to you. And I guess the third thing is to do both those things well. If they make good food, and they serve it to you in a way, in a place that is inviting and comforting and where you want to be, then that, for a restaurant, should be a win. Now, there are two restaurants, and they wanted to, this is before they got going, and they thought, what do we want to base our restaurant on? And the things they came up with were these two lists of, I guess you could say, values. Thanks, Soph. One of them, creativity, innovation, and excellence. The other one was tradition, authenticity, and relationships. Now, as you see those two lists, can you think in your mind of any place you've been that might fit into one of those categories? A restaurant, a cafe, a dining experience of some kind that might be either creative, innovative, excellent, or more traditional, authentic, about fostering relationships. The two that I was thinking of, and that as you look into the backstory, that these two actually, these are the values that they started with, were these ones. The Hatter and the Hare is a restaurant in Bayswater, and Miss Marple's Tea Room is in Sassafras. I think they might have one or two other places around, I'm not sure. And those values that they had and they wanted to start with have actually shaped the way that they designed their restaurants, decorated them, created their experience as you come in, the way that they have done their food, what they're offering, what the menu looks like, how they name it. And so if you've been to either of these two things, you'll know that these values actually come out when you go and visit that place. Hatter and the Hare, their food is all Alice in Wonderland based. And so the names, you don't order based on the name because it tells you nothing about what you're going to get. The name is something really creative and unusual, and the food that you get is equally creative. The decorations inside the place are very innovative. It's very much an experience when you go into this place. Miss Marple's Tea Room, their basis was, we want to create an authentic, traditional English restaurant cafe. And so you go there and you get tea and scones. You can get a shepherd's pie. You can get fish and chips. They're not New Zealanders, but you can't say it without a New Zealand accent. And you can see the decor. It's very much like an old English little cafe, pub type thing. And so their values that they wanted to start with have really shaped and designed the place that you then go to. Has anyone been to either of these restaurants? Yeah, a few hands. When you walked in, would you say that what you experienced was what they had intended when they started out? Would you say that it kind of aligned with these values? Yeah, a few nods for those that have been. Yeah. We've been going through this series about values, and Lani kicked off by looking at what are values, why do they matter. Jared then looked at what are your individual values that you hold dear, the things that drive your life and that guide the way that you live. And now we're looking at not individual but shared values, values that collectively we hold together. And those two restaurants, the teams that run those restaurants, if you look through kind of their background and their history and interviews of why they got started and how they operate, those values come through in their conversations. This is something that, as a team, they hold together and they work towards making sure that those values are lived out as a team. And so when you go to that place, you experience it because they're all on board and they say, these are the things that matter to us. This is what we want to see happen in our restaurant, and we want you to experience when you step into it. And so as we look at shared values, the question that we really want to explore is this: what matters most to us here at Burwood Church? This is a conversation that the elders have been having for a while, and we wanted to share it with you and also get your feedback as well, because what matters most to us here are the things that end up being our core values. Our core values are the things that they're there, and you have experienced them, you have lived them, you have probably contributed to them, but you may not actually be aware of them. And so this series is really about helping us identify as individuals what matters most to us, how can we live that out, what matters most to us as a community, and how can we live that out as well. Last week, Jared looked at a passage in Scripture where Jesus outlined the core values of his kingdom. And it was in Matthew chapter 5. If you have your Bibles, I want to invite you to open up to that, because we're going to visit that again now. But as we visit it, we're instead not going to look at it individually, but we're going to look, what does this mean for a community? Because Jesus was talking to who? When he did the Sermon on the Mount, who did he gather around him to speak to? Anyone remember? His disciples. His disciples were the ones who were going to then continue the mission and carry on these values as they created what we are now a part of. And so in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is giving this sermon, and he is giving these values to live by. And one that we're going to look at is in verse 21. If you've got the blue Bibles, page 830. And Jesus said, "You have heard," there's a D there that you can't see. "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders shall be subject to judgment.'" So I want you to think about that for a second. What is the value that Jesus is putting forward here? What is the value behind this statement? Value of life, sanctity of life. Any other thoughts? What's the value behind do not murder? Why is that important? Safety. At a very simple level, you could also say it's about respect for their person, similar to sanctity of life. So that's the value. Jesus then goes on. He says, "But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment." What's the value there? Has the value shifted? Is it still sanctity of life? Is it still respect? Or has it moved on to something else? I'd suggest that here, Jesus is saying, I want you to value relationship. I want you to value community. Because at the end of the day, if you're angry with someone, are we in a good spot? We are, just so you know, but no. There is a fracture in that relationship. And so the value of sanctity of life, of respect, has kind of shifted now. Jesus has gone a bit deeper and said, no, the value here that I want you to hold on to and look at as a community of people is the value of belonging, of community, of relationship. And then he goes a little bit further. He doesn't just say, hey, this is what I want you to value. He goes on, he says this: "Therefore, if this is the value you have, if you are offering your gift at the altar and remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift." Jesus is doing something really incredible here. He's taken the original value in the Ten Commandments He's taken it from value of life to value of relationships. And then he said, it just doesn't stay there. This actually has to be lived out. And this is what it looks like when you're living this out. Let's have a look at another one. You have heard, I don't know what happened to D. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. What's the value? Commitment? Loyalty? Respect? Then he goes a bit further. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. This doesn't seem to be so much anymore just about commitment or loyalty, does it? It seems like Jesus is going a little bit deeper, a little bit closer to home, and he's saying, that's what you valued. Now I want you to value integrity. This is not just about your actions. This is also about what's in your heart, your thoughts. And these values need to be coming from that place. And then he goes on and says, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. 10 commandment value, commitment. Jesus value, integrity, who you are, authenticity. Live it out. If that value doesn't mean anything, you won't do this. But if it does mean something, you're going to do everything you can in your power to live by that value of integrity so that you won't step into that space. And Jesus is showing that values must be lived out. And we've kind of repeated this the last 2 weeks because it seems that when Jesus is talking, he's not just interested about giving you the knowledge of what to do. He's saying, this is what you should understand, but this is how I want you to live this out. It's got to have an impact on your life. Otherwise, it's nothing. Values, if they're real, will guide our behavior. If values are real, then they're going to guide what you do, how you live, how you make choices, how you make decisions. Earlier this year, I spent a fair bit of time thinking through what are the values that I want to live by for the year. And one of them was discipline. And I thought, okay, yeah. I felt God was saying, hey, I want you to get more disciplined. I want you to get more focused in this part of your life. And so Julie and I do exercise 3 times a week. And I've got this value of discipline that I want to live by. And there are many mornings where I don't want to live by it. But if I don't do something about it, it's no longer a value. If I don't actually get up and do the work, then I can't genuinely say that this is something that I value. I'm just saying, this is something I'd like to value, but not yet. Maybe down the track sometime I will, but not right now. Values have got to be lived out. So Jesus is giving these values to his disciples. Jump forward 15 years, and we have the early church gathering, meeting, and they're doing their best to work out what does it look like to live out these values. And we're going to do the same thing we did to the Beatitudes, but with the stories of the early church. So, in Acts 2, it tells us that this early group of Jesus followers, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. The same question, what values do you think are here? What are the things that they value, that they hold close? Community? Yeah? Relationship? I thought biblical living, like they want to follow the word, they want to read the word, they want to know it. They value community, they value relationship. What about this one? All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. What's the value? It's probably pretty clear, isn't it? Like these guys really valued being together. They valued generosity to the extent that they're willing to sell whatever they had to help somebody else. And these values, can you see that they're not just ideals, things that they think are good, but these are things that actually drive how they live. To the point where, as we read, if someone is in need, they're actually willing to sell their house and use that money to help that other person who's in trouble. Like, you want to talk about living by your values? Man, that is huge. But it means that these values were something that deeply, deeply mattered. They weren't just periphery things. These were core values to this community. And then there's this verse, this passage in Acts chapter 6. In those days when the number of disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic or Greek Jews among them, man, my D's and my G's, Greek Jews among them complained against the Hebraic or Israeli Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So there's a problem. And the early church sees this problem, and they've got to figure out, what are we going to do about it? So the 12 apostles gathered all the disciples together and said, it wouldn't be right for us to neglect the ministry of the word of God in order to wait on tables. Brothers and sisters, choose 7 men from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them and will give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the word. What are the values here? What do they value in this community that they're saying, hey, we've got this problem, but we need to solve it? And they solve it, can I suggest, by using their values. They're like, hey, justice is important. Equality is important to us, so let's make sure that nobody is in need. But also, hey, let's innovate. Here's a problem. We're not sure how to solve it. Let's come up with something new that's going to solve the problem. And so they do. And leadership, let's give people a chance to grow in their ability to serve others and take on more responsibility. Biblical living, we want to stick to the word and to prayer, but we also want to look after these guys. So you can see how their values actually ended up shaping how they dealt with this situation. Their behaviors, their decisions, and the culture that they had revealed what mattered most to them. It revealed their values. And it's the same for us. Our behavior as a community, our decisions as a community, our culture as a community reveal what matters to us. And so we've been on this process of uncovering what are the values of this community. What are the things that really matter to us? And we'd love you to help out with that. Whether you've been here for the first time or this is your 500th time, what you've experienced as you've come into this place, as you've been a part of a Burwood gathering maybe during the week, or a Burwood group, Clean Up Australia, or walking a lot of steps, or whether you've joined a Bible study somewhere, as you've been in that environment, you've experienced what Burwood is about. As you've walked into this place and sat down and had a coffee and connected with people, you've experienced what Burwood is about. And so we would really, really value if you could we're going to take a few minutes now, to scan the QR codes. What we've got there is a list of values. And in that list of values, there's the value and then a short description of what that value is all about. What we'd love you to do is choose 5 that you think represent what your experience has been like as being a part of Burwood. And it doesn't matter if this is the first time you're here or you've been here lots of times before, you have a unique perspective that we'd love to hear from. So it's as simple as choosing 5 values there that you think most encapsulate what Burwood is about. And these are the things that are based on what you've experienced. We're not looking for what you think Burwood should be about, but what has your experience been? What are the things that you've seen and heard and been a part of, which are reflected by those values? And then the second question is just whether this is your first time, how often you come, just to help us understand your perspective. So I'll give you a few minutes to fill that out before we keep going. If you're struggling to know which ones to choose, go with your first instinct. Go with what your gut's saying. And if it's still a struggle, try not to think too much about it. But on behalf of the elders team, I genuinely want to thank you for giving your thoughts here and putting in your responses, because this is going to help us work through this a bit more, and then we'll come back and share the next part of the journey with you and get your feedback on that too. And there's a spot down the bottom if there's another one that you think is not listed there that you desperately want to put down. Feel free to put that in that other section as well at the bottom. If you want to do it later as well, feel free just to grab the code and just leave it in your browser, and you can spend more time on it this afternoon if you'd like, or sometime during the week. And when you think back to those two restaurants, it's the shared values that each team held that led them to creating these two different spaces. Two different experiences, two different locations, two different looks, two different menus. But those shared values really played a massive role in shaping what those two things look like. And it's exactly the same for us as a church community. You know, shared values, I once heard them described kind of like the banks of a river. They work to define and unite us. You think, if you don't have the banks of a river, what have you got? A flood. You've got a lake, or you've got a marsh or a bog, but there is no that water and together. It just goes wherever it wants. And so shared values, they define us, they unite us, but also they inspire and motivate us. You know, you think about the banks of a river, because they're there, what happens to the water? It keeps moving. Yeah, it keeps moving. It doesn't just sit there like a lake or a swamp. It actually is able to keep moving. And they don't just inspire and motivate us. I think values guide and direct us. A river is always moving because the banks keep the water together, but it's always moving forward. It's always moving in a direction. And it's got purpose. And I want to finish by sharing a passage of scripture which I think for us outlines why our values matter, because they're pushing us towards this beautiful purpose that we have. And it's found in Ezekiel chapter 47. Ezekiel has had this vision from God about rebuilding the temple, this place where God dwells. And so towards the end of that vision, this is what happens. There's this man who's been kind of directing him through this experience. And Ezekiel writes, "The man brought me back to the entrance to the temple, and I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. Water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar. He then brought me out through the north gate and led me around the outside to the outer gate facing east. And the water was trickling from the south side. As the man went eastward with a measuring line in his hand, he measured off about 500 meters, and then he led me through that water, which was now ankle deep. He then measured off another 500 meters and led me through water that was now knee deep. He measured off another 500 meters and led me through water that was up to my waist. He measured off another 500 meters, but now it was a river that I couldn't cross because the water had risen and was deep enough to swim in, a river that no one could cross. He asked me, 'Son of man, do you see this?' Then he led me back to the bank of the river. When I arrived there, I saw a great number of trees on each side of the river. He said to me, 'This water flows toward the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah, where it enters the Dead Sea. When it empties into the sea, the salty water there becomes fresh. Swarms of living creatures will live wherever the river flows. There will be large numbers of fish because this water flows there and makes the salt water fresh. So where the river flows, everything will live. Fishermen will stand along the shore from En-Gedi to En-Eglaim. There will be places for spreading nets. The fish will be of many kinds, like the fish of the Mediterranean Sea. But the swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They'll be left for salt. Fruit trees of all kinds will grow on both banks of the river. Their leaves will not wither, nor will their fruit fail. Every month they'll bear fruit, because the water from the sanctuary flows to them. Their fruit will serve for food, and their leaves for healing." Can you see the picture that this angel, this man is presenting to Ezekiel? He's saying, this river, it doesn't just exist because it's a river. It actually has a purpose. And the purpose of this river is to channel what comes from the sanctuary, from the presence of God, into the areas around it. And as it goes, it doesn't just leave a bit of water there. What happens? Everywhere the river flows, everything will live. This water, it flows out, and as a result, it changes everything it impacts. Everything it touches, there's growth that comes, but not just growth. There's food, there's sustenance, there's goodness, there's healing that comes because this river is flowing. And I think, man, what an awesome picture of what it looks like to be a community of Jesus followers. It's this picture where when we spend time with God, when we choose to live out the values that He's placed in our hearts and choose to do that as a community, it guides us in this direction where it's not fruitless, it's not pointless, it's not emptiness. It actually brings life, it brings healing, it brings goodness to the Dead Sea around it. I think there's no more awesome privilege or challenge than to live that out. And it's my prayer that as we continue to explore what our values are, that we'll reach that point where we are a clearly channeled river. And as we go and do the things that God's calling us to do, and we live out those values, it just doesn't give us just a fuzzy, warm feeling. It actually translates into seeing the communities around us, the people around us, the people we love, that we work with, that we live next to. It actually leads to healing. It leads to goodness. It leads to life for those around us. I want to invite the guys to come up. We're going to sing our closing song. And it kind of touches on this, and it says, man, nothing else matters apart from that presence of Jesus at the temple. Because from that, everything else flows.